Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Peak and Flow podcast. My name is Dave Nixon and this is yet another episode in the BSFT30 series. Today I'm going to be talking about the difference between self-confidence and self-esteem, and it is a very, very important distinction. This can come up for people, especially when we start to feel like a failure when we make a mistake, when we make an error, when we fail, we feel like a failure, and we see failure as a person rather than an event. It can also really come online for individuals. And look, to be fair, I'm yet to really meet someone. I maybe would have met less than the people that I can count on one hand that have not blended self-worth and self-confidence, and especially self-worth based around the opinions of others, how they're seen by other people, whether they're seen as knowledgeable, whether they're seen as right, whether they're seen as useful, whether they base their worth on their own ability. So if they can't do something, then they're a failure, so their self-worth goes down. So because they can't do something, that's some self-confidence, but they attach it to their self-worth. Because I can't do it, I'm not worthy. That is a really, really interesting, what would you call it, conundrum? Conundrum? So, the difficulty here is how often we associate our self-worth with our self-confidence. And today, it's really about going through and explaining the differences of these two, let's call them mental phenomenons, and then how to basically pull them apart and treat them as separate, because they're both useful to really understand and unpack. Now, more than anything, when we really peel away all the layers, what this can commonly just come down to, even though people don't communicate it this way, but it's commonly a deep fear, is that they're not lovable unless insert X, insert condition. This is why it's called conditional worth or conditional happiness or conditional esteem. So I'm not lovable unless I'm knowledgeable. I'm not lovable unless you see me as being helpful. I'm not lovable unless I keep the peace. I'm not lovable unless I can be useful to you. I'm not lovable unless I'm capable. All of this, right? If you literally go and do the Enneagram, I've talked about it on an earlier podcast, each one of those type, basically the core structure of that type is saying, I'm not lovable unless X. And it is a distortion that we have developed over time, and it's usually in the face of the primary caregivers and so forth. So let's pull it apart, shall we? So let's start once again with a couple of key principles. That is mistake. I already mentioned it, but mistake is something that you do, not who you are. Failure is an event, not a person. Failure is an event, not a person. That's really important. We want to move away from the idea of it's failure or similar being personal, pervasive, and permanent. Personal, it happened to me. Pervasive, it happens all the time. Permanent, it will happen forever. This is how it's always going to be. So we can move away from that to that happened there then. And when we look at failure as that there then, rather than personal, pervasive, permanent, then we can start to move away from this idea that our ability is somehow linked to our self-worth. Which also leads to this concept that you are not what you do. What you do is something you do. It's not who you are. So I am not a coach. Coaching is something that I do. And that's a really important distinction. And it's a very important distinction for athletes, because athletes get caught up in this structure of like, I'm an athlete. It's like, no, that is something that you do. You are not an athlete. Like, I'm an embodiment of it. Sort of. You embody the athlete, but you are not the athlete. And that's a really important distinction. Otherwise, they become an injured athlete as opposed to being who they are and they're currently dealing with an injury. Very, very different. Massively different identifications. So when we come down to it, confidence is based on one's ability. Esteem, another word for esteem is value or worth. Now, the important distinction to make about esteem is that it's actually inherent. So when my beautiful baby girl was born just nearly 3 weeks ago now, she didn't come out and I looked at her and go, oh, here are the conditions of your self-worth. She didn't have to have nothing for her value to be absolutely unconditional, inherent. And unfortunately, she will learn from me because of my blind spots and the stuff that I'm learning about myself, what the conditions are in order to receive love. And that's how we all learn our conditions. So if I'm helpful to you, I receive love. Therefore, love equals helpful equals love. If I achieve and I get love from you, then achievement equals love, and so on and so on and so forth. And these are the mental distortions that we create that end up filtering the way that we interact with the world around us, and commonly blending confidence and esteem. So the word unfolding can get thrown around, and it can be really esoteric, and it can be just kind of like a bit of a I don't know, what would you call it? Like a spiritual wank, really. But I use it a lot. And what I'm referring to when I talk about unfolding is actually like meeting parts of you that learn specific conditions in order to be worthy, needed, loved, whatever, to be able to meet those parts and learn to see through those parts. And this is when we look at coaching and development or anything in that nature, you've got remedial work and you've got generative work. Generative work is where are we going? Remedial work is what's stopping me from going in that direction. I'm yet to meet someone who doesn't have to deal with some type of remedial work in order to generate action and drive forward. It's rare, it's less common for that person to absolutely have to 100% go sit down in therapy and take things, but that's the level of individuals that I work with. Doesn't mean that that's not an important pathway for people that are probably stuck more in the past, and that is an important pathway. The thing is that in order to generate forward, we kind of have to release the handbrake, but sometimes people have 4 flat tires and an engine that doesn't fucking work. You probably got to go to the mental mechanic, right? And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean that in the sense of like, just take your time, you'll get back on your feet, but you just got to get through that. And I have in the past. I've spoken to that at length. There's 850 podcasts probably talking to variations of that. So that's important, very important. But unfolding is meeting parts of you that have probably been unmet for some time. And when I said seeing through them, it means that the conditions that you learn to place on your self-worth, you don't unlearn them, you see through them, because they're things that you learned when you were 6, 7, 8, 10, 12. Now at 30, 35, 40, whatever, you can see that was just something that you learnt then. It's not now. You probably don't need those things now. The positive intention of holding on to that this is where people get caught into a little bit esoteric again, but spelling, the myth, like mythology, when people get stuck in that, it starts to circulate. Now you're an adult walking around with this belief that you made when you were 12 years old, in the face of someone that was probably upset and wasn't aware of what they were saying and doing. And so you can grow past that. So that's why I'm saying see through it, because otherwise if you work on it, you make it something, you make it an it that you have to carry around with you and work on, as opposed to seeing through it as if you were just seeing through fog and coming out the other side. So one of the key things here is feedback is friend, and you want to be able to separate feedback from your self-worth. So if you look at feedback, well, look at this. If you look at feedback, it presupposes feed forward. So feed forward is what you're putting out. Feedback is what's coming back in. And so understanding that means that it simply is just information feeding back to you. It's not truth, reality necessarily feeding back to you, especially if it's somebody else's opinion, because that is absolutely splintered and filtered with all of their fluff. And that's okay. That's we're all fucking figuring it ourselves. But the key thing here is being able to separate whatever feedback comes back is separate to your self-worth. Your self-worth is absolutely inherent. No one can take that away from you. But we do understand that we learnt to hand it over. So in order to receive love, in order to receive value, I have to do X. And so it's kind of, yes, unlearning that, but we unlearn it by seeing through it. So, and that's a path. It's not just a switch. And it's not a switch, but if you're around enough people that are going the same way, that are in their same sort of, let's say, unfolding, and hold themselves to account, not necessarily hold you to account, but hold themselves to account, you will start to really walk that path. And the path only reveals itself as you go down it. It doesn't reveal itself beforehand. It's like those lights when you walk into a room and it triggers the lights to turn on. Prior to that, the lights were dark. You couldn't see down that way. You have to actually walk down it. This is an interesting one when we start to look at, well, what are the components that make up this type of work? Because a part of it is going to be absolutely yourself. People can lean into this spiritual construct, and it is self, it is spirit, it is essence. There's many other names that we look at here. But what I'm talking to, and when I talk about self or spirit, I'm not trying to give you this sort of like ungodly existential thing that you just hold on to, because people then end up using their personality to hold on to that, and then it sort of ends up being separate. So it's not that. Here's how I explain self, spirit, or essence. Different words to mean the same type of thing. In your head, there's a voice. There's a thing that hears the voice, and then there's a thing observing the thing hearing the voice. And that thing observing usually doesn't judge. It's very, very quiet. If not, it doesn't say anything at all. And it simply just observes. And it's been there the whole time. It's been there forever. The problem is that people identify with the first voice, or they identify with the thing that hears the voice. It's actually those things are more linked towards your personality. And I'm generalizing with this analogy, but bear with me. They're more linked to your personality. And if you can step back and actually learn, and this is the whole quieting of the mind and observing, and just observe those things as opposed to seeing as them, you start to actually shift in this very present space of essence, your true essence, right? And so your true essence can actually have an integration of personality. It's called personal essence. And in that space, you get to meet people in both their very being and their human experience. And that is, in the human condition is probably a better word, the very being and their human condition. And that is a really genuine, authentic expression. And that's really what I'm pointing at here. It's not about being in a beige coat, walking around, just looking at trees. I'm talking about this idea of being able to be present, honor yourself while honoring everyone else without making it weird. And that's my words. Maybe that's my shit I've got to work through. But without doing all that sort of stuff and just being able to see you. We can only meet people up to the level or to the depth of the level that we meet ourselves, and we only accept love to the level that we love ourselves. And so the work is done here, and it's done through this type of work. Because it's more the conditions that I put on my self-worth, the more that I need you to behave a particular way in order for me to feel good. I need you to see me in a particular way in order for me to feel good. You're not responsible for my self-worth. I am. And it's time for me to take my power back. So how do we do this? Well, with self, it's learning to really connect to that. I'm going to talk to that in a sec. But when it comes to mind, it's actually allowing yourself to be a beginner with a lot of these frameworks and systems and understandings and meeting yourself and all this. In the same way, if you hadn't been to the gym before and you decide to go to the gym, just be a beginner. Just be a beginner, because you can't start anywhere else. And so if you're worried about being a beginner, well, catch that and be a beginner about learning how to be curious about your judgment of being a beginner. So, all right. There's this beautiful, and it's actually behind me, a book called Pearl Beyond Price by A.H. Almas. And the main crux of this book is simply talking that you are the pearl, and then we as a human construct give it a value. But you do not hold value. You are invaluable. But as the human construct goes, we want to be able to value things, but you are pearl beyond the price. It's like, that is absolutely inherent. The human construct wants to give it a price, but the pearl is a pearl. And so we can really move down this pathway of separating confidence and esteem, and we can do it by simply having a self-inquiry. And what I mean by a self-inquiry is that when you feel that sort of friction, frustration, especially around somebody's response to you, how somebody sees you, whether you couldn't fix something and then you feel this sort of same old feeling, like, how old do you feel when you have that feeling? Is it 12? Is it 18? Does it really feel like a 35, 45-year-old? Like how old do you feel, right? That's separate. But the self-inquiry is, hang on a sec, what's going on here? And the first part is, I'm just going to name this emotion. I'm going to give this emotion a name so I can actually ground this for a second. Otherwise, it's just, I feel frustrated, angry, and I'm in it. If I can name it, I actually make it an it. I can sort of see it and observe it. And this is the difference between saying, I am angry and I'm experiencing anger. If you're experiencing anger, you can allow it to wash over you rather than to run you. Emotions are not instructions. Emotions are not instructions. You absolutely can observe them as you're experiencing them. It is a practice, and one worth doing, because the whole spectrum of emotion is profound and beautiful. All of it. It's all information. So name the emotion, and then in this moment, what have I actually attached my self-worth to? What's really bothering me here? What have I attached my self-worth to? And given that, what's the positive intention of attaching those two things? What is my positive intention of attaching those two things? Is it to be seen a particular way? Is it to self-soothe? Is it to be capable? What is the positive intention? Not the positive outcome, the positive intention in, not out, of attaching my self-worth to being seen, being capable, being loved in the name of someone else, being seen as successful, whatever it is. What's the positive intention? And am I getting that outcome? The positive intention is to be seen as being worthy, and am I getting that outcome? The answer might be no. And if the answer is no, given that, well, what new possibilities come up for you? Because we have these positive intentions from when we're younger and they get a particular result. And so we run it again and again and again and again. And it becomes a way that we interact with the world. And then we grab that later in life and we apply it to other circumstances that are similar but not the same. And we don't get the same result. Now we have a problem. But people don't have problems. People have patterns. So we don't want to look at the problem. We want to look at the problem behind the problem, which is a pattern. And when we can look at the pattern, we can start to realize, we go, hang on a sec, I haven't got flexibility with this pattern. So how do I actually gain flexibility with this pattern of thinking based on my positive intention so that I can actually show up different? And this is flexibility, and this is where power lays. So am I getting the outcome? Answer would probably be no. So given that, what new possibilities arise for me? How else can I choose to respond to this moment? And then what new action can I choose? What new action can I choose? And that's your beginner. Now you're a beginner creating a new mental pattern and a new physical behavior. They got to be matched up, and there's got to be an intention, and you got to make it sure that's relevant for now and today and who you are. And that's a practice. You don't just switch it and it's gone forever. If you have a particular thought that comes up, it doesn't just leave. What ends up happening is that it'll arise again in the future, but it has less emotional pull. In the same way that when your phone rings, at some point you saw someone's name and you had this emotional reaction, and then later on, maybe a year later, you saw the same name, so the same thing popped up here, and you don't have that emotional reaction anymore. Something shifted, something changed, but you got to go through that process. And that process takes time, and it takes repetitions in the same way it was actually created in the first place. But if you do this hard work, you'll move into a space of consistent self-worth. I don't want to call it unconditional self-worth because it presupposes conditions, but consistent self-worth. It's just called self, actually. But alas, here we are calling it self-worth, but self-value, and realizing people can't take it away from you. It doesn't mean that you may not struggle with that from time to time, but it's the knowing of that, a deep knowing. You can still entertain others' viewpoints and feedback without having to wear it and without it affecting you. You can still entertain and take on other people's feedback and their viewpoint without having to wear it and without it affecting you. It takes practice, but you can. And in doing all this, move to a space where you have the ability to be loved, and that, like, self-love. And what self-love is, self-compassion. It's holding space. It's that, right? It's just seeing and allowing more than anything. It kind of gets a bit corny sometimes, but it's true. It's just this self-acceptance. Self-love is self-acceptance. So when someone has a problem with self-love, I'm like, well, what haven't you accepted yet? So the ability to be loved or accepted is unquestionable. So if you have that, if your self-value is separate to your self-confidence, you can get on with your dreams and you can go after what's important, because as you come up against the hurdles, you're not associated with your self-worth, and that's what's stopping you. You can move through even though you're uncertain and you're lacking confidence. Good, you're a beginner. You should lack confidence. That's how it works. You get confidence by experience, but holding your self-worth separate means that you really develop this massive superpower to be able to move through the face of adversity and not making it personal. And on that note, team, I'm done. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this podcast, it would mean the world to me if you share it with someone else that you think would also enjoy this podcast. If you haven't already and you want to find out more about the BSFT30 series, all the notes are in the show, or the links rather, are in the show notes below. If you want to find out more about our immersions and our other trainings, they'll be there as well. But that's me done for now. I'm out. Until next time, peace and pizza. I'll see you soon.